Welcome to Student Activism Then and Now. I'm Amy Robinson. It's wonderful to see you all here in the auditorium of the Bovee University Center. Welcome. Welcome to our online audience around the state and around the globe. We're glad to have you participating as well. And of course, welcome to our panelists. They're going to make this evening worthwhile. We have history on the stage. It's so exciting. And so I'm going to start by introducing our first panel of four. These are CMU alum and activists from the Vietnam era. And so let me welcome Mary Irvin. We heard her as our songstress just a minute ago, and that's really, as I talked to her and her fellow activists, what she's known for in the group. And she's going to have some great comments for us coming up on how the activism songs can motivate a crowd and also calm people down. It's fascinating. We'll be talking about that. Also, welcome to Ron Williams, who's here from Colorado, and he is co-founder of the Mountain Rush. It's an underground newspaper that was published during the Vietnam era here in Mount Pleasant, and he's continued along those lines through his career, working in alternative media. In fact, today he is executive director of freespeech.org, and so we will be talking to him about some free speech issues, and welcome to his fans. And Kathy Courtney, fascinating woman. When I hear people talk about her, I hear her often described as a pioneer of the women's movement. There are others here who I'm sure could be described that way too, but Kathy, suffice it to say, is no shrinking violet and is out front. She is leading the charge, and we're delighted she could be here with us today from Houston. And so we welcome her. And then welcome the final panelist on our first panel this evening, and that is Rick Kozierski of Detroit. You know, Rick was the student body president when the protests began here at CMU, and he had a fascinating perspective because when the protesters took over the ROTC hall, he was in the university president's house and really got a view of how administration reacted and handled the crisis at the time. So we have a full story here with these four panelists. We want to get started. So Kathy, thank you for your music. Irv, thanks for our music.
We just met each other today. So.
I know, right? Irv, also known as Mary, not Kathy. So tell me, how did you get involved with music in the activism movement?
Well, I think when I was in junior high, I got my first guitar, and I also had come home from a summer camp where actually we were in, quote, Camp Dearborn, which was lily white, but kids that had been to college or somewhere and heard Peter, Paul, and Mary or heard a record came back, and they were singing at that camp when the boys and the girls got together. So that's when I heard If I Had a Hammer. And I thought, wow, cool song. I came home and threw my stuff in my house and went to the record shop and bought Peter, Paul, and Mary's first record and started learning a lot of things. So that was the beginning of it.
You know, and isn't that fascinating because you started learning about activism through pop culture?
Yep, I did.
Yeah. And then from there, tell me more about how you met up with CMU activists through music and incense.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Now, Kathy and I ended up coming to school the same year. It was the fall of '68, Trout Hall, for those who are familiar with campus. And my housemate, whatever roommates, did not like incense. They were about ready to go to the RA and have me, busted. So I smell incense coming down the hallway one night, and I follow it, and there's a long line that goes to Trout, but right at that corner, now I'm starting to hear stringed music of some kind. And I don't know, interesting. So at the door, hello, nothing. Well, there's this huge theater trunk with hippie beads in front, whatever they were, and Kathy was sitting down there playing her auto harp. I play guitar, we both were in choir together, but we also sang songs. We began singing songs together. And being in some of the groups, I don't think I went to SDS, but we had something called SCAR, the Student Committee to Abolish the ROTC program.
Mm-hmm. So, we're going to be talking more about that in a minute. Sure. I want to ask you too, we all kind of know how activist songs can really bring a crowd together and motivate people to go out and march and be passionate and have this cohesive feeling in their protest. But you had a really interesting story about how it can also help people calm down in times of crisis or worry.
Okay. Well, my sample would be, even though this is a little past the times that we were dealing with Vietnam, I was involved with the Freeze nuclear weapons, and we were protesting things up at Wurtsmith. And we had taken several people from Alma who were young students who'd never been to anything before. And it was like, there's this certain line, if we crossed over it, we're going to be on the base, and we would be subject to being arrested. And we were Velcros behind our backs and put in these buses, minibuses, and we're being transported to what was the racquetball courts, which were closed to the base that day except for our processing. So these young kids from Alma were getting really upset, like what is going on, what's going to happen? And then there's the bus driver, who was a guy from the base. And so I just started singing, "Down by the riverside, I'm going to lay down my sword and shield, down by the riverside, and study war no more." And we're making a comment about what he's doing, but it was making them sing, so they were being less agitated in their own anxiety, kind of.
Could you feel the difference?
Mm-hmm. Immediately.
What's your favorite protest song?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Okay, I'm going to ask the rest of you too, so give us some thought while I put her on the spot.
Well, I'm very fond of Joan Baez in particular, as far as women in the folk and protest genre. And she sang a song that I sang early on here called Saigon Bride. And it's very quiet, but it's like, farewell, my wistful Saigon bride. I'm going out to stem the tide. Some say it's yellow, some say red. It will not matter when we're dead. And on. And that some point somebody got, like we were just done with a rally and somebody start kind of like, because I'm singing this kind of soft song. And my friend Bonnie, word, that got to bleep. And shut that guy up.
Have you ever been moved to tears by a protest song?
Yes. Well, Joan sang, now she was on stage down in Kalamazoo the night the bombing started in Baghdad in 2003. She'd go off stage every once in a while to check with whoever was watching or listening to the radio, TV, and at some point it did start, and she came out and, "This is my song, O God of all the nation, a song of peace for our lands and for theirs." This Finlandia tune that was beautiful. Yes, I wept. It met the moment in a beautiful way.
Ron, let me ask you. I said I would ask each one, so I'm going to start with what is your favorite or most memorable protest song?
Well, certainly music really fueled, I think, a lot of us during the 60s and early 70s in our work, because there were so many artists, so many bands that were singing about social issues, and they were doing, it's poetry, music, it's very magical, it's powerful on a primal level, and so the role of music for me was central in inspiring me, calming me, soothing me, inspiring me. In terms of the answer to your question, I would say Imagine, John Lennon's song. And there's so many others that I could choose, which, all music is it's a matter of taste and what speaks to you. The reason I am talking about Imagine is because I've always thought that our job is twofold. One is to resist and to protest and to challenge injustice, but the other part is to put forward a vision of society that we believe in, to talk about solutions in the future. And I think that Imagine is an unbelievable, holistic, very short moment that speaks to a whole lot of things of what could be. What do we aspire to? It's sometimes easy and necessary to tear down and to challenge and to fight, but if we bring love and compassion and we have a vision for what can replace it, what can transform our lives, that is an incredibly important part. And so Imagine does that for me.
As a protester, I mean, all of you have had your moments where you have certainly been speaking out on unpopular issues, on contentious issues. Does music, it kind of can convey these ideas in almost a more acceptable way, I think.
Yeah, I think music, good social protest music, is propaganda in some ways. It is organizing in its own way. Because it's seductive, it feels good, and it's connecting on a more primal level, on levels that a panel could never possibly approach. And that's why we love that you've incorporated spoken word and music into this.
And now, Ron and I did not really have a chance to talk before the panel. We tried, but just could not catch each other at the right moment. So let me ask you now, what is maybe one of your vivid memories from that time, from your activism days at CMU?
I'll give you two examples that both have to do with ROTC, which I think will come up a number of times, that I think really speak to the question of sometimes you can resist in very small ways, and sometimes you resist in bolder, more risk-taking ways. And I was a disc jockey at WMHW, playing rock and jazz and blues, music programming, not political stuff. And there's a log in radio that tells you when you have to play certain public service announcements with MHW, which is non-commercial. And I saw that there was a 60-second PSA for ROTC. And I don't know when this was, not exactly the year. And so I drew a line through the log. I initialed it, which is what you do according to FCC, and I wrote in Mount Pleasant Food Co-op. And then I basically kind of did a spur-of-the-moment conversation about the Mount Pleasant Food Co-op and why it was a wonderful thing. I didn't really talk about what I was crossing. I just substituted it, and I did it in a way that was appropriate to the FCC regulations. And I was, of course, suspended for 2 weeks off the air because I had altered the log without permission. That's the small thing. That's the small. I couldn't be presenting my music and my commentary and then feel like I was going to promote people joining ROTC and being part of that. The bold part is that when Cambodia was invaded and Kent State went down, we seized the ROTC building, and I was part of that. And I remember one of my vivid memories was sitting in the commander's office with my feet up on the desk, using his phone to call campuses all around the country and get firsthand immediate reports on other occupations and other demonstrations. And then I would write a little note card, and we had a bulletin board, and we took all the stuff off the bulletin board, and we called it Liberation News, and we were tacking up in real-time reports from around the country of other campuses and what was going on, because we were fairly isolated within the ROTC. So you could say that's one of the ways I got my start in media. That was media.
Well, and let me ask you this. For people who, most of us who weren't here at the time, the takeover of the ROTC building was perhaps the most visual kind of peak of the protest here. So give us a sense for how that occurred, how long you held it, explain a little bit about the situation.
There's probably better people that can do that than I, but I did enter the building the night it was taken. And I remember I found a plastic toy rifle, and there were not too many of us inside the building at that point, and there was a large group of students and other folks standing outside who weren't sure whether to come in, and they weren't sure what was happening, but they knew something big was going down. And I remember hanging out the window and going, shooting the cap gun off, and it created a big laughter, and then more people started coming in. And so I remember that. We stayed in that building for a week, I want to say. There are others here that might have better knowledge and recollection. How long?
It's 5 days and then 12 days for the encampment outside.
Yes.
And President Boyd said, he knows that story. I said, don't worry about it. We got to leave pretty soon anyway. We got finals.
And, the core of this, and we're going to hear, I think, something from former President Boyd later, is that President Boyd had come out of Berkeley, had been a veteran and seen a lot of things in terms of protests. And there
during the free speech movement.
Yes, and there was at the state police post here in Mount Pleasant, they had brought together a riot, heavily armed riot group that were ready, kind of a SWAT team, to come in and clear the building. And many of them were angry at us. They felt what we were doing was unpatriotic, and they were looking to, I think, smash some heads. And President Boyd kept them from doing so. I mean, the cliche was that he brought us donuts. He really knew it wasn't weakness, it was strength, and he was very savvy about it. And I can't say we were able to make our statement in a nonviolent way. We didn't destroy the building or burn the building, and we gave up the building. So we were able to express our outrage. Our protest was allowed to go forward. And yet the property of the university was protected, which probably wouldn't have been if we had been attacked by the police and forcibly removed. And it's such an example of how this dance can happen in a free society that it's something that still amazes me.
And let me ask you this finally, because you have a long history, starting with your bulletin board in the ROTC building and your career since working in alternative media. As you look back now with the perspective of all these years, what would you have done differently, or how do you view that free speech moment in your life?
Well, there's certainly a thread of my work from Mountain Rush really led to, I went to Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio after I left Central Michigan, worked in a factory and then went to Antioch. And I came back from Antioch to Detroit, my hometown, and started the Metro Times, an alternative weekly in Detroit. And we built that out over about 20 years into a chain of alternative news weeklies in different states, Ohio, Florida, Texas. And I started a company called Dragonfly Media in New York in 2000 that was about green sustainability, alternative healing modalities, spirituality, and the environment, and certainly social justice. And have found my way into Free Speech TV now. And Free Speech TV, if you think about television in America, every national television network, without exception, is owned by a billionaire, it's owned by a corporation, or it's owned or to a large degree funded by a government, so it's state. We are a 501c3, we are independent, we are committed to social change and social justice. We're in 40 million television households in America, and yet many of you probably never have heard of us because we run on a $4 million budget a year with 17 amazing people in Denver. And we reach a couple million people on a monthly basis. We're on Roku, Apple TV, we're on Android TV, we're on Amazon Fire, we're about to launch on Sling TV. So we're opening up increasingly across there. And in terms of what I would do differently, I just feel that I have had a very consistent thread of organizing work, looking at how to adopt various media platforms as tools for social change. And it's not the media people that are the heroes and sheroes. Our job is to amplify the voices and lift up the issues that are shut out of corporate media. So I have 1,000 things I would have done differently in every one of those projects. I've learned through hard knocks, and I've made a lot of mistakes, but I don't have regrets, and I feel there's a continuity in my work.
Very good. Thank you so much, Ron.
On Free Speech TV here, at least on cable station, it has Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. And I'm assuming that's still happening. Does anybody know about that? I don't know. But it used to be on every day, and sometimes it was repeated later in the evening.
There are still
Oh, good.
places.
Yay.
And if I may say so, PBS is outstanding. So, okay, Kathy. Kathy. I know you have a lot to share.
What's my favorite song?
What is your favorite song?
My favorite song is Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around. I learned that song in the summer of 1967 at a church in Detroit hearing Dr. Martin Luther King as a high school student. It was awesome, and to hear the voices of civil rights. And then during the so-called Detroit riots or the Detroit Rebellion, you need to look that up, there was lots of people and people coming together, people against racism. I was in YIPFUGS, that stands for Youth, Peace, Freedom, and Justice. So I was already getting radicalized, and I was shocked. And so I heard that being sung, and there was picket lines, and I was with my pastor in my Methodist Youth Fellowship group, and I almost got arrested just for singing on the sidewalk because Governor Romney had declared martial law and said you couldn't have more than 3 people apart at abreast and da-da-da. And I've sang that song all through this Vietnam War and in Washington, and arrest in Washington during the May Days. I sang it with Quakers who were getting beat on the heads for singing and sitting peacefully, non-violent. I've sang it all through the endlessly, seemingly endless wars, the Gulf War, and Iraq and Afghanistan, and of late with Black Lives Matters, and then with the Women's March in January, because I made up, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Sing it. Turn me around, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on a-walking, keep on a-talking, marching up the freedom road. So I'm not gonna let cynicism or apathy or pessimism or racism. The millennials at the Women's March really liked, ain't gonna let no dictator turn me around.
So, you mentioned almost being arrested, but you were arrested here at CMU. Tell me about that.
The main one that I do want to talk about is, and as I tell this story, and I'm gonna try, I've cut it down because I know I'm not supposed to give a speech, but it's supposed to be talking, but you know me. So it's live. So I want you to think in your brain, why is it that a US flag still causes so much angst, conflict in people if there's any disrespect to that flag? Where's that coming from? Okay? So for the record, this flag desecration charge against me is false, false, false. You can look it up. And I did not defile, desecrate, or maliciously damage the US flag. And so on May 4th, when the students were protesting about Kent State, and 4 students were killed. You know that, right? And I'll never forget the image of us. Who else remembers?
Jackson State.
And I'm not there yet. But on May 4th, we're watching on little TVs, all squished in, black, white TVs around the dorms. We were shocked, crying, angry. So that's when we moved to take over the building, and the ROTC and other people were doing that all over the country. That's a whole other story. Kajerski knows a lot about that. But the ROTC guys were furious. So on May 14th, 2 more students were killed at Jackson State University, and many injured. So have you heard about Kent State? Sure. 10 soldiers and Nixon coming, we're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming for dead in Ohio. You've heard that over and over. Where's this song for the black kids who were killed at Jackson State? Think about it. Notice the racism, notice the feelings. So we've been meeting around flagpoles around the country, praying and eulogizing and protesting, whatever, for ever since we had flags. But on that day after Jackson State, I met with other art, music, theater, theology students, got together. Dr. Swanstrom, we went to the art department, we got coffins, flags, We dressed up a woman like a Vietnamese shrouded mother, a soldier. I got drummers from the Chip Marching Band. They didn't want to be named, but you know, they had this, yeah. And so we had a very somber funeral procession, remember?
Through every academic building. When they heard the muffled drums, people were to go silent until they didn't hear it, and then classes resumed.
Right, no chanting loud stuff. It was all very somber. So we're mourning the lives lost at Kent State, Jackson State, the Americans and those also, the innocents killed in Vietnam. It was pretty somber. But the next day, I was singled out, and I got arrested. And that's a whole other story. Ask me about the Keystone Cops chase through the campus. Different story, not for this record.
I watched it happen through the music building.
It was just weird, but it was really scary. Just personally, it was really scary. You go to jail, you get fingerprinted. I was a lot of verbal abuse. I was manhandled. I was really scared. And so I want to give a shout out, thanks to RIP to Reverend Father John Godreau, who got together with pastors, who got pastors' money and bailed me out of jail. And then I didn't know it while students were gathering to protest and take over another building, and Krajewski knows the backstory of that one. So at the hearing before Judge Dent, he was pretty dented. He was real cold. And he refused to listen when we had plenty of witnesses about the flag that was already old and tattered and torn, and you know, the Swanstrom, I heard, still has that flag. Can somebody ask him? It should go to the library here, don't you think? Okay, but somebody ask him. The judge sided, though, with this one military officer and this one cadet who charged me, saying they saw me, you know, purposely, maliciously damage the flag from the second-story window of the ROTC building, well over 200 yards away. He wasn't thinking. He shouldn't have done that. No charges ever should have been. He should have dismissed it. So it was a big hassle for me because there was a lot of losses, with loss of my semester, loss of my job, college work study, loss of my.
Now, as you experience that, let me ask you, so how would you kind of help us to understand or define the boundaries, if you will, of a protest? There is a point where you're peacefully protesting. There's a point where maybe you're involving theater and music and even becoming very engaged and passionate and active. And then there can be a point where people cross a line.
I have a good example of that.
And maybe it turns to violence, it turns to destruction. How do you feel about that boundary?
Well, I have a good example of that because we tried to submit an evidence for those of you who remember, just a month before, downtown at the draft board, young men were tearing up the draft cards and they put them in a fire, they're burning them. And the witnesses, over 200 people witnessed, it was me who leapt from the crowd to pull the flag out of the fire, beating it against my body to put out the fire. And I scolded those people saying, this is not the way to win friends. Do not harm this flag. I guess I get emotional thinking about it because it pissed me off that I got arrested when I've had a whole life of patriotic stuff with the flag and my family and church and schools. And I saved that flag and defended it, saying, you may just be a piece of cloth, and you have the constitutional right, certainly, to burn it and to desecrate it and trample on it, but it really pisses people off. Because it's like a symbol of tribalism, you know, one tribe against the other. And there's other ways to get our message across, and you don't harm it. Because and of course that's flashed forward. Look at all we have now with, you know, taking the knee, Pledge of Allegiance, standing, national anthem. That's a whole other discussion, but, and I've been a collector of flag stuff ever since, because I lost, I was guilty, I had to have appeals, I had to have a bunch of kegers and fundraisers, you helped with that. And that was well before, you know, GoFundMe and internet, so I was begging, and I lost a semester at school, and then people say, oh, we should go ahead and press on and challenge the constitutionality of the Michigan law and all that. I'm going, no, the U.S. Congress and the Supreme Court, ever since the 1800s, have protected your symbolic right to do anything you want with the flag. But I have a quote.
Let me point this out while you're pulling up that quote. So I don't know if our online audience can see it, but I'll just mention we have a podium off to the side, and Kathy made a point of bringing an American flag, and that's where we ended up putting it. It is on the podium, so obviously near and dear to your heart.
All right. Well,
just a few minutes left. Tell us what you have.
So my daddy came up with me to be of courtroom support, and then later he wrote an essay and a letter to the editor at the Detroit Free Press, because he was just shocked that he witnessed military officers of the court, police, lie in a courtroom. So we were pretty shocked about that. And I just want to remember that no matter what you do, that with my lessons are, don't mess with the flag, don't mess with it. It's a religious symbol. And military officers and police and people can lie if they want to bust you. It can happen. You need to watch your back and have your friends. So remember this. When fascism comes to America, you know this quote? It will be wrapped in the flag and carrying a cross. Who said that? Sinclair Lewis, who said this: those who would burn the flag destroy a symbol of freedom. Yeah. But amending the Constitution to change that would destroy part of freedom itself. Supreme Court, 1989. But don't burn the flag. Don't hurt the flag. Carry on. And be patriotic. And every time you go somewhere, for over 40 years since then, I bring the flag. It's me that brings the flag. Oh, Courtney with the flag again. And there are lefties, you know, really literally lefties who go, why do you have to do that in every picture, every demonstration? Because I'm patriotic. That's what. Yeah.
Thanks so much. And now, Rick, you have a great perspective because when all of this protest was blowing up here on the campus of CMU and the protesters were taking over the ROTC building, Rick was in the university president's house. And so you have this perspective of how they learned about this protest that was blowing up on campus and how they reacted. What did you see?
Well, first of all, my favorite song is "We Shall Overcome."
The old. We shall.
But I was student body president. It was May of 1970, and the anti-war fever was high on campus. And I had several good friends that were in the movement. As student body president at that point in time, I was kind of neutral. And as a result of Kent State and Nixon invading Cambodia, there was a protest here at Central that turned into the occupying the ROTC building. I was conducting a meeting of the Student Senate, and my vice president at the time, Mike Leader, said that he was going to go somewhere. And during the Senate's business, one of my friends, John Childs, appeared up the stairway of the auditorium in the Pierce building and came down the stairway and whispered in my ear, "We're taking the ROTC building." And I swallowed and continued with the Senate meeting. And right after that, I went back to see what was going to happen in the mall. And I received a call back at the dorm from the president who said, "I need you to come to my home now." And I went to the president's home, and all the deans were there, the vice presidents were there, the police chief of Mount Pleasant was there, Tom Martin, and a news reporter from WCEN, Mount Pleasant Radio. And the discussion centered on what to do from this point on. Several deans, the provost, Charlie Ping, wanted to clear the building. And President Boyd, of course, that was not one of his plans. One of the vice presidents, and it comes from an unusual place, the vice president of business and finance, Norval Bovee, who this building is named after, led the discussion that the building should not be cleared, no attempt should be made to violently clear the building. At that point, the city police chief, Tom Martin, said, "We do not have enough police officers in this county to clear this building, and I advise you not to try and clear it." And we had several contacts with Tom Martin throughout anti-war demonstrations in Mount Pleasant, a couple of marches that went downtown, a march that went to Mission Street and closed the street for 20 to 30 minutes on a Friday night. And we were fortunate not only that we had President Boyd, and we had good faculty, good deans, some of the vice presidents that were behind us. So
the whole scene surprised me. I went after that meeting to the building, and my vice president, Mike Leader, had come out of the building by then. But violence was averted, and this campus came very close to violence that evening at the president's home.
And Rick, let me ask you, because we often hear in a crisis that those first moments really can be defining. And it sounds like you had some cool heads during those first moments. How much of a difference do you think that made? Did you feel the situation, some of the energy settle down after you got through the initial takeover?
Well, I wasn't in the takeover, so my friends were.
Right.
As far as the administration, I felt more comfortable after the meeting. I was very surprised during the meeting that the university provost, of all people, wanted to use the police to clear the building, and fortunately he didn't prevail, and cooler heads prevailed, including the president and the city police chief.
And he wanted to bust some heads. There were people who were locals.
No, he didn't. But
He didn't, but-
some of the people at the state police post
Militarists.
wanted to use police force. The commander of the state police post at that time dissuaded his troopers from doing that and said that he would not participate in that without cooperation with the university. So we were fortunate on a number of areas that the protest stayed peaceful.
And those of us on the inside made commitments to Boyd. Rick knows this. We were not going to trash the building, burn it. It wasn't going to be here. It was going to be, all inside, outside. And when, I won't say who, but a couple of hotheads wanted to open up the armory. There's guns in there, And so we stationed Delaney, the one of the biggest black, big-haired guy we knew. You're guarding the armory. Don't let people in and mess with these guns and get any guns because this is going to be peaceful. And he goes, got it. And so it could have gotten worse, but it didn't happen.
So Rick, the takeover of the ROTC, or as you say, ROTC, extended over the better part of a week or more. And so maybe, I don't know if you can answer this, but was there a tipping point? Ron talked about not only protesting what you don't like, but then having some conversation about promoting love and the things you do want. Was there a moment or a period where it shifted from protest to more dialogue?
Yeah, John will talk about that with the
Sure.
education, the freedom schools, the teach-ins that we did, the faculty.
The tent city that
Tent
was
city.
set up on
Yeah.
Warner Mall.
Right, so long-term that occurred. Did it occur during the ROTC?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And tell me about that.
Well, I don't know, several hundred, less than 500 probably, students put up a tent city outside of Warner Hall in order to protest the war and to maintain a presence on campus, at the center of campus, the administration center of campus, Warner Hall, and that went on for how long,
12
Kathy?
days, 5 to 12 days was
Yeah.
the intensity of it. Yeah.
And President Boyd dealt with that in the same equal, cool manner that he had dealt with the takeover of Freedom Hall by the students, in that he did not have the police clear the tents and the residents of those tents. He talked with them about sanitation. He made some university services available. And he even called some parents about some students who, when the tent city was going to dissolve, there were a handful of students who stayed behind that didn't want to leave, and Dr. Boyd called their parents and got their parents involved, and they finally left. I mean, that's the kind of person that he was, and we were fortunate to have him because there were a lot of people out in the community that were unhappy that this building was taken, and it was a university building. There were people in the legislature who were unhappy. A lot of pressure was put on President Boyd by the legislature to end this protest. Fortunately, we also had Governor Milliken at the time, who was a moderate Republican none of which any of you who are young would even understand what that is. There's no such thing today, but in those days we did have moderate Republicans who could be reasoned with.
Well, it is time now for our panel switch. I want to thank.
Oh, I didn't know that. We're not going to talk about all the methods of the movement, all the things that we did, and all the things that you can't do. Okay, afterwards, meet with me if you're a member of an organization. I want to talk about how do we shape a movement and organize from the small things. I have a whole handout on how do you go from, people say, I'm not political, I don't know anything. I go, do you recycle? Something. So you start from reading and studying and supporting and all the different ways that build a movement for your issue or electoral candidates, and how do you win?
So after we are done with both panels, there will be a reception out in the lobby, and so people here in the auditorium, we do invite you to talk with our panelists and get more information from them.
Two things. One,
Ron.
I just want to honor you and your team for putting this together tonight. It's an incredible opportunity for us to have an important series of conversations. And second, I know all of us are anxious to speak with any of you in the audience during the reception, so please stick around.
Carry on.
And if you're a singer, collect songs.
So before we break, I want to let the auditorium know and you at home that we are going to have a few minutes of some words from the former CMU president, Bill Boyd, who was so instrumental in actually keeping the peace here on campus during those really difficult days. And so we're going to have that while we switch out the panels, and then we'll be back to talk more about activism then and now.
And live stream, can they write live stream comments and questions?
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask a question about the student demonstrations that happened in May of 1970 and a tent city that was set up, the People's Park that was in Warner Mall after the Kent State shootings.
Yes.
In comparison to Berkeley, how did you view these events?
Well, I was surprised and pleased by the good nature of the central student body. For example, when they occupied what became Freedom Hall, the ROTC building, they permitted an inspection every day by the administration to be sure that the sanitation was okay, etc. I couldn't have imagined that happening at Berkeley. When Sproul Hall was occupied, for example, it took police to get the kids out. There weren't any daily visits by an administration member. So I was surprised by the good nature of the students who occupied Central Hall. I mean, Freedom Hall. Mm-hmm. Freedom Hall. And the same was true for the tent village. At Berkeley, the People's Park episode, which occurred after I had left and gone to Central, was a violent episode in which Reagan had called out the National Guard. Our People's Park was really never anything but peaceable. I never felt threatened by it, for example, though I did regret it very much because it was ugly and because of the sanitation problem. And most students got tired of it and agreed to the university's request that they take down the tents. A few did not, and I'm almost ashamed to admit, for those few I called the parents and asked them if they would use their influence, because sanitation was on my mind. And within a day, the last of the tents was gone. So that was not a fiery episode in Central as it had been at Berkeley.
Did you actually bring up campus beautification with the students in the tent village? Did you?
Yes, I talked to them about how ugly it made the campus.
Okay. We also have been told that when Freedom Hall was occupied, you told the students inside that you were more afraid of the reaction of those who opposed them than the students themselves. Was that true?
That's true, and there's proof of that. I had asked the faculty that no one call the police without first checking with me. And there was an ROTC officer who was a faculty member, in the way that the contracts with the ROTC give faculty status, and he called the police and claimed that Kathy Courtney had desecrated the flag, and he had her arrested. I called the commanding general, who was in charge of our division of ROTC, and asked that he be removed from the campus immediately, and he was. That was evidence of my intention to keep the campus peaceable.
I see.
That faculty member, incidentally, I discovered after the fact, was also the chair of the local John Birch Society, which you may be too young to know.
Oh, no, I remember the Birch Society, a very conservative organization.
Yeah.
That's interesting. You mentioned your working relationship with the Faculty Association and Bill Bulger. What was your working relationship like with the students on campus?
It was very good. The students received my most immediate attention when I went to the place, because they had been the most restive, according to the administration. They were revolting against the presence of parietal rules, which were quite strict about what hours they had to be in the dormitories and so on. Parietal rules don't exist anymore, but they did then, and they were a matter of considerable concern. Plus, the administration in those days made no distinction between off-campus and on-campus. Students were students all the time, and whether their offenses were committed on or off-campus, the campus concerned itself with it. And I thought that was carrying in loco parentis too far. So my first immediate attention was devoted to the students, and we got rid of the most obnoxious of the parietal rules, and the students felt that they had, in a sense, won in their battle with the administration. I think it was a mistake on my part to devote my first attention to the students. I wish, in retrospect, that I had devoted my first attention to the faculty. The faculty was more discontented than I understood.
Welcome back to Student Activism Then and Now. I'm Amy Robinson, and we're delighted to still have you with us. If you're watching online, we invite you to leave comments or questions there, and if we have time, we'll certainly get to them. Let me introduce our second panel now. And so we are going to welcome John Childs. And John is from Ann Arbor and has some interesting things he's going to talk about with us in terms of the family impact. And John, you'll be explaining it for us, but his brother was in Vietnam and his father was not a supporter of activism at the time he was an activist. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Denny Adams is joining us from Mount Pleasant. And Denny also has a family perspective in that while he was going to college here and protesting, he was a young father with a son at home. And that certainly played into his decisions on, for example, whether to protest in Washington, D.C., where arrests were that much more likely. And so we'll be talking about those aspects as well. Welcome to Matt Mertz from Mount Pleasant. Matt has a great perspective for us in that he came in toward the end of the protest period when it was still going pretty well, but it was starting to settle down just a bit. And he was able to then follow this whole issue of activism through about a decade here at CMU, and has a lot of interesting comments on how to maintain continuity in an activist situation. And then finally, on our second panel, we welcome Janice Fialka from Detroit. When I was told about Janice, the phrase I kept hearing is she can make the personal is political. And she is a great person to really depict how the personal is political, as she is still an activist today. And in today, what she works on are issues involving people with cognitive impairments. And we'll talk with her more about that. So I want to welcome our second panel here. Thank you all for joining us. John, we're going to start with you.
Okay.
All right, so give us some information on, first of all, your involvement in the activism here at CMU.
I graduated from Plymouth High School in '68, and my politics were either apolitical or moderate Republican. My parents were both Republicans. In fact, my mother was mayor of Plymouth at the time. My father was a Marine Corps pilot, test pilot during World War II. The Chicago Convention is what radicalized me. All these people getting beat up for not doing anything. And I said, this can't be right. After that, I started investigating, looking into the Vietnam War, reading some books, how this all started way back before Truman, and why they've been kind of screwed over by the United States telling them one thing and then switching sides back and forth. So in '69, I got involved with the moratorium, the big march in Washington, 500,000 people, and helped to organize the buses, which was difficult because we had the buses set up, and when the companies found out what it was for, they'd cancel it, and wouldn't let us take the buses. Finally, President Boyd intervened. He also helped us. We said, hey, we paid for this food, can we get some boxed lunches? So the food service made us all up boxed lunches to take. So we went, and the march was wonderful. We got to meet a lot of people, and it was really a great experience. Then when the Kent State thing happened, things got much more ugly. Now we realize they're willing to shoot students. And that's when we decided, we were running off copies of Ethel in the student government office. Thank you, Rick.
Yeah, let me stop you right there. Ethel, that's life backwards. And that was, and this was another a student publication.
Yeah, actually, Andy Marks and Paul Jagano are in the audience, so they're really responsible with Byron Cuxhouse for getting it started. And they kept begging in the pay, hey, can somebody come and help us? So we went, originally we just started helping them run stuff off on the machines and type stuff up, and eventually we kind of took it over.
And so we didn't have social media, we had Ethel. So
500 copies.
All right. Now, as you were getting into your activism, you had a father who was a pilot and in the military, and you had a brother serving in Vietnam.
That's right. Well, actually, when we first started, my brother was here at Central. When we went to the moratorium march, I called my dad and I said, we're getting this set up. I'm responsible for food and buses and stuff. And he said, if you go, I'll cut you off. You're done. I won't give you any more money. It's over. So the day we were supposed to go, and he sent me a letter, the only letter he ever sent me, talking about his experiences in the war as a test pilot, having to land and put one of his buddies in the back of his plane because his head had been chopped off and things. It was pretty raw, and he'd never talked about it. So the day I was supposed to go, I called him up. I called him at work, which we never did. The only time I ever called him at work. And he answered, E.E.? And I said, yes, this is John. He said, yeah, and we talked a little bit. And he finally said, you think this is as right as I think it's wrong, so I guess you have to go. But I'm not happy about it. So that's how that all happened.
That was pretty good acceptance for someone who felt so passionately the other way.
Yes, it was. I mean, my older brother who went to Nam in '71, and when he came back, I picked him up at the airport, and he said, let's just ride around. His wife had divorced him, mother was over there, and he didn't really want to talk about it. In fact, we talked about everything else, but we never talked about the war. About 5 years ago, he was being treated for cancer, and his wife called and said, could you come out here to New Jersey? He's not eating. I think if you come, we can get him to eat. So I went out there, and we ate milkshakes 3 times a day, and I put on about 20 pounds, and his weight stabilized. And I asked him at that time, I said, and that was the first time he brought out a book that he had of photos from Vietnam. And I said, well, were you ever mad at me? Here I was protesting the war, and you were over there. And he said, no. He said, Dad always told us we were to follow our own beliefs and do what we thought was right. And that's what I did, and that's what you did. So no, I was never angry about it. And he said, besides, see these shoes? All my shoes are made in Vietnam.
Well, how was it for you to be protesting and be an activist with perhaps divided loyalties, in the sense that you felt passionate about what you were doing, but you wondered how your family was viewing it?
Well, it made, Thanksgiving, Christmas dinners difficult because it always came up. We couldn't not talk about it because I would usually say, hey, did you see, especially once the Pentagon Papers came out and we said, you've been telling us we were wrong all along. We were right. We told you this is what was going on. And so it got pretty heated sometimes, especially when Mike was in Vietnam. And then when the Days of Rage in May of '71, where it was, if the government won't stop the war, we'll stop the government. Yeah. So we went out to D.C. and we went on the street. I had a helmet on, a motorcycle helmet, and the police had been told everybody in helmets are leaders. So as soon as I stepped on the street, they grabbed me, and they had these big like semi-trucks, and they had it divided up for the women's cell on one side and the men's cell on the other. And so they roughed us up and threw us in there. And there was one other guy in there, and I said, gosh, I guess I'm going to need a lawyer. And he said, oh, I'm a lawyer. And it was Lenny Weinglass, who helped defend the Chicago 7. And they had picked him up by his license plate just coming into town. So once they had the van full, they took us over where they were holding us at this big field. And when we got there, Lenny said, we can tip this over if we just shift our weight. So we started shifting weight, and the thing starts to rock. And everybody that was already in the field came rushing over and started pushing the fence down. So they popped open the door and pepper grenade and closed the door. And it got very hard to breathe. Yeah, but it calms people down instantly. So while we were there, Bella Abzug and some other people were coming in. They were saying, hey, this is too bad. This shouldn't have happened. Then they took us to an arena somewhere, and they were processing us, the largest mass arrest in U.S. history. And we're the only people ever to be given financial compensation for a violation of our constitutional rights. So while I was there, we had a lot of time because obviously 12,000 people, it takes a while to do them. And there were some senators and representatives up in the stands. And they were, hey, come up here. So we went up, and the guy said, can I call your parents and tell them what's happened? And I said, yeah. So my parents got woken up in the middle of the night and said, hello, this is Senator so-and-so. Your son's been illegally arrested in Washington, D.C., and we're fighting to get him free right now. So I think my dad and mom were like, whoa, what's he doing there? Because they didn't know about any of that.
So let me ask you, when it comes to being so involved in activism and protest, how, if at all, can you guard against what I would call message drift? You wanted to protest the war, and many of you have said, working for the soldiers to bring them home so fewer people died. And yet it was, I don't know often, but it certainly was viewed at times as maybe critical of the soldiers themselves. How do you guard against that?
Yeah, I think that was hard because there was some anger at the soldiers. Although most of our anger was directed toward these guys being sent there. We all know people that had been sent. My brother was fairly old. He was 25 when he went. Most people were like 18 and 19. In fact, when he was there, his sergeant came up to him on his 26th birthday and said, Sergeant Childs, happy birthday. You're no longer eligible for the draft. So he went in November '71, and Nixon said in December '71, no more draftees will be sent to Vietnam. But it was hard. You had to, we were very radical. We were upset about stuff. But when we took over the ROTC building, and like I say, we were running off Ethel at the time, and one of our friends, who's remained nameless, came in with chains and locks, and he said, Kent State, we're taking the building. So we went in and locked it up. We never tried to take the armory because we were, it said the optics of this have to be we're a peace group. And if we get violent, the TV makes us look like the bad guys. We can't do that. So thanks to Rick Kajerski and Boyd, we talked back and forth a little bit. We had several meetings saying, how are we going to end this? Some people wanted to, be violent about it. Some people, we said, let's just be the bigger person. We'll walk out and say, we really don't want this war. We think Razzies should be off campus, and let's go with that. So it turned out very well, but President Boyd was very, involved in that. And if it hadn't been for him, it probably could have gotten pretty bloody. So I was glad for that.
All right, we appreciate that, your comments. And let me mention to our audience watching at home, you can send questions or comments. And we do have a comment from a librarian, a Mount Pleasant native, who messaged us saying during their years at CMU, we also protested what is now known as the global war on terror. I want to encourage all of you and those in any generation who participated in movements to donate the materials of the movement to local libraries or archives. The history is important, and we should be proactive in protecting it and preserving that.
A lot of things came out of the Vietnam movement, the Earth Day idea, the women's movement, some of the African American stuff. The movement started to split a little bit, and after the war was pretty much over, people went in and started doing different things. So a lot of the people who were involved didn't just fade away, the war's over, we're done. They got interested in doing other things and trying to change things.
Denny, while John had concerns or thoughts of his brother in Vietnam and his father being opposed to his activism, you had a little one at home waiting for Dad to come home from the protests. How did that impact your activities?
Well, I mean, it had some impact. I just wanted to speak for a moment of the overview of the time frame, because the one thing I notice about students today and being around campus, especially in the summer when you can hear things, the icons of rock and roll and protest and music, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, these were our compatriots. These are the people our age. There was a countercultural revolution starting before the war protest really started. And so I see all of this kind of coming out of that once we said, okay, we are our own people. We have this cultural thing that's happening. Some like to label it sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But there were certainly a lot of serious things going on, especially when it got to the point where our brothers were coming home in body bags, and Vietnam became a real threat to all the males especially, and there certainly were some of our women compatriots who served in Vietnam that had that same fate, so it wasn't strictly male. But the opportunity, and I think that was the thing that struck me most about getting ready for this, was going back and looking at the time frame. I think I mentioned to you at lunch that the only thing I had firmly fixed was my daughter's birth date on December 1st, 1968, and I knew I graduated at the end of 1970. So it's like, okay, when did these things fall into place? And just as an example, the one semester that I was editor of CM Life, the fall of 1970, we had 3 primary big speakers on campus in that 17 weeks. First was Dick Gregory, then was Tom Hayden, and then was Jane Fonda. And we had music. We had the Temptations. We had Neil Diamond. We had, MC5. There were lots of things going on. And so I guess what my word to current activists is, you don't have to be out in the street and carrying signs. I encourage you to do that. But even getting on the university's committee to select speaker series, to select music, these all are people that have effects on your culture of now in this time. There's things to be learned from us, and there's things to be, avoided the mistakes we made, some of the things that we can talk about tonight. So in that sense, the most important 2 to 4 years of your life are that 18 to 20, 22 years age, usually while we're in college. But one of the most edifying things in the anti-war movement and with the moratorium and marches was we really moved off the college campus. There's always been this idea that if you're in college, you're some egghead and, these things happen on campuses, not in our community. And when we finally recognized that we had to go to talk to our compatriots that were working in the factories in Flint, in the factories in Lansing, they weren't in college, they were out in the real world working, but they were all our age, and they all had a number in the draft, so they all had the same pressure from what we were looking at. So that kind of, sealed the framework of what was going on.
What was your involvement in protests here on campus?
I was there when we went into the building at the ROTC building, Freedom Hall. And you need to also know, this was basically an empty, worthless building on campus. The only thing in it was about a 10 by 14 office where the ROTC was. The rest of it was an old gymnasium. It was originally the Finch Fieldhouse. Central Hall was the field house back in the day. So now an occasional archery program was in there. There wasn't much going on. And the funny thing was, I always joked about it after the fact, if we had burned the building down, the university was 2, 3, 4, 5 years later, paid somebody to tear it down. We would have burned it down for them for free, and they could have collected the insurance, but sometimes they didn't follow my suggestions. That's probably a good thing. But I was the editorial director at CM Life at that time, and of course, my politics at the time were very far to the left of most of the rest of the people in the journalism department. So I found my way in the editorial part of that. I just went back to see that semester and realized, boy, I didn't really write that many editorials. And often there'd be somebody else on the staff that write one that was like the complete opposite of what I wrote. But I was happy that I had some influence then. If anybody remembers a great cartoonist named R. Cobb, back in the day, had great political cartoons. My favorite is a military person standing on a rock with a smoking machine gun, and all you can see to the horizon is dead bodies, and it just says, "I win." And that's the kind of stuff that Cobb did. So I was able to kind of get that in there on alternate with Frankly Speaking. And then, the year that I became editor, I was able to do a few other things. I brought in Liberation News Service, which was an alternative news service to AP and UPI, and we would use stories that I felt fit. One got me in a lot of trouble, got a lot of flack from, was a story about the Vietnam Veterans Against the War staging a guerrilla theater action in a small town in Ohio with a little circle square. So they all came in uniformed with wooden guns like we used to march in the marching ships with, and had other friends dressed in black attire of the rice paddy workers in Vietnam. So the Army came in, they made bang, bang, bang noises, everybody in the pajamas slapped ketchup on themselves and fell on the ground, and oh my God, the community went crazy because they thought they were actually being attacked, and then right in the middle of it, they stopped and started talking to people about, everybody stood up and they said, okay, this is why we did this. But there were people in this community who wanted to hang me for even publishing that story, but that's the kind of approach that we took. When you couldn't get people to hear your voice, you went out and looked for things that made them stop and listen to what you were doing, which was part of what the protest was about.
Let me ask you this, because I know you were careful to some extent about the protests that you participated in personally. For example, not going to DC, because as a dad with a family, a wife and a child, you didn't really feel you could afford to be arrested.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was
and
a whole
what'd you
issue.
say, you'd have to hit up the mother-in-law for your
Well,
bail
right,
money?
that was probably the biggest part of it. If I knew I went, I'd end up in jail and need a bail money, and I wasn't going to ask my mother-in-law for it. So,
and yet you're in a position to publish, provocative articles and
Yep.
to encourage this kind of dialogue, this kind of conversation. What kind of pushback did you feel from the community? Not on a personally threatening level, but just people who were not happy with what you were doing.
One of the things I made sure to do, if you go back and look at that semester of papers, you will see every time, probably 4 or 5 times, the number of column inches of editorial space dedicated to readers' responses. Sometimes I'd run 2 pages of letters, and they were often critical of me, critical of other things that were happening on campus. Nobody liked Jerry Rubin using foul language, So like I said, we dropped him off on I-94 at Detroit and made them walk to the terminal because we were so upset with them when we took them back. But that's a whole other story. But you have to, with position comes responsibility. And, I mean, there were people in my own newsroom when I was editor that didn't speak to me because they didn't like my politics. But yet, I made sure they got their column inches, even if they were writing something against me. I remember, publishing dual things. I said mine, they said theirs, next to each other. It's about the forum. And I guess that's my message to activists today is, in my life perspective, I look back and I remember my times here in that era, and it's this big. I mean, it's like, oh my God, this was the time of my life. And then I go back and went, December of 68 to the end of 70, that's 2 years. Look what happened in those 2 years of time, and it was just amazing. And for any of those who haven't taken the opportunity, I think the moratorium booklet is out there. The most stunning thing to me is the picture that's in that booklet. When we had a candlelight march here in Mount Pleasant against the war, and we're talking about 69, October, November 60, and 69, and there were 13,000 students at the university. There were barely more than that people living in Mount Pleasant, maybe 18,000. And we had 5,000 people in the street at night with candles. There's a picture from the tower of Warner Hall. You can see all the way to the town center in Mount Pleasant, and a solid column, 2 lanes wide of road of people marching with candles. And that's, and that's what came to be. There were people that came from all over, even nearby counties, to be in that march because everybody had been touched by a body bag returning, their boyfriend from high school coming back without a leg. I mean, these are the kinds of realities that we face, certainly much more so now because of our great ability to triage in war. We have a lot more veterans coming back with a lot more serious injuries. In Vietnam, they died. They just didn't make it back. So there is that aspect of it, but take advantage of your time. It's a short 4 years here. Go for it. Nothing can happen to you in terms of expressing your opinion and pushing for what you in your heart feel to be right, other than having to defend yourself. And if you can't defend what you do, then maybe you shouldn't be doing it. But there are so many opportunities now in so many levels, and John kind of touched on it with, I look back at that and that era from 68 to 72, Women's Aid started, Listening Ear started, the Tenants Union, the first ACLU chapter here, Green Tree Grocery was then Mount Pleasant Food Co-op started. So some of my friends would often say, yeah, we patted ourselves on the back and the war was over, and then we let those guys we argued with all the time go take over politics. And I said, no. People went into teaching. People went into social work. People started other organizations to serve people. That whole concept of what we talked about culturally, I think most of us went out and did. And one of the great lessons I always told to my daughter when she went off to college was, I said, just remember, some money costs too much to make. And she never understood that until she got out, got a high-paying job, got stabbed in the back because somebody right behind her wanted a little more money, and that whole thing. And I think that those of us who went into other areas of thing, the first thing, my first job out was with Department of Social Services. So that was a great thing for me. I just found it unsatisfying and walked away from it because it changed from the Great Society programs with a 2-page application to the newer way of looking at persons who receive welfare, and it became a 36-page application that you had to bring a note from everybody you know, even though it's supposed to be that nobody knows you're an assistant. So, but to students today, there's so many opportunities, so many opportunities.
Put a lot into your 2 years. Thank you for your comments.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. Matt, you have a great perspective on history of protest here at CMU that really translates into a larger message in terms of continuity and how to continue and really accomplish something. Let's talk about that. First of all, tell me when did you show up at CMU, and kind of how did it fit into the activism moment?
I showed up in '72, and I was very disappointed that I missed all the good stuff. And this actually kind of goes into the continuity thing. I came in, first year I did student government because that's where you kind of look and go, well, that must be where politics are. And the next year I did Mountain Rush with Ron. And the summer came up, and I'm going, well, great, let's do something. And there's no Ron. There's no nothing. It's just me, and I wanted to put through you have orientation here. I wanted to create a disorientation manual to pass out to all of the students who were coming to go through orientation. And I contacted a lot of groups. I didn't know squat what I was doing except for what I'd learned for a year working with the Rushers. I could do layout. I knew something about writing articles, but man, some of those were terrible. I didn't even know where the printer was until finally somebody told me where the printer was, and I handed the stuff out. And I got really, and we got people to show up the next year because I'd go around to all the organizations that I knew. If I could find somebody left, I'd say, hey, write me something. And if I couldn't do that, I'd find something some student was, a friend of mine who I knew would do it. Like, could you review all the bars in the area? I found volunteers. That was very easy to do. And so there is a continuity, and I was lucky because I got here in '72. The unlucky was it wasn't a little earlier, and I stuck around till '81. So I got to see a lot of stuff, and I could see how these things progressed. And some of the things that I noticed and I learned, because I did Mountain Rush, I did PURGEM, which is a public interest research group in Michigan, which is a offshoot of Nader's Raiders, and some things that we tried, like one of the things was we were told by the university that if we could prove it, that PURGEM had enough support, we will let you get funding. So we went out and we got over half of the students to sign a petition. Now, if they checked the signatures, there may have been a couple doubles and triples, but still, we got a huge amount of petitions. And when we showed up, said, here we are, and they gave us exactly what they offered us at the very beginning. Nothing. There was we got nothing for all that effort except for spending a whole year collecting. A year ago, there was a student group here on campus called CM Action. They went around and they wanted to collect signatures because they wanted to prove to the university that there was a gender and sexuality center should be placed on campus. They got 2,000 signatures. And is there a gender and sexuality center on campus now? No. And now and they were ignored. If I'd have talked to them beforehand, I'd have said, folks, get a guarantee. If they say, you give us 2,000 signatures, we'll give you a center, fine. Don't do it the other way around and say, I hope you're really nice to us later on, because it's not going to happen. I'd never do a petition drive. I would never do anything unless, if I'm going to do it, you have to say that if I do it, I get it. I get what I ask for. If somebody sets up a thing and says, you know what we really need is, this is a very good issue, but why don't we sit down and set up a committee to study this?
Is that the kiss of death?
Oh, you're gone. You're gone. And it happens to everybody. There's a movement right now to put in marijuana dispensaries in Mount Pleasant. They sent some of the city commissioners, and they set up a commission. The commission came out and said, you know what we need is dispensaries have to be 300 foot from schools, and that's it. Great. When it went to the city commission, they are now suggesting one that is 1,000 foot from schools, 1,000 foot from churches, 1,000 foot from daycares, and 1,000 foot from parks. That leaves 3 blocks in the entire city. On the west side of Mission, it's the old antique store, which, by the way, a group immediately came in and kicked the other people out and gave the people a lot more money to rent the place. They're out of Royal Oak, and they already have 5 dispensaries. So we're talking, every time you went to a meeting about those, there'd always be a couple suits in the back. And you knew they were lawyers from someplace else. So
from your
get the
ex-
guarantees
From
before
your
you do it.
experience, committees don't work, petitions don't work. What does?
What works, I'm not sure exactly what all works, but I can tell you at least one, and I gave you the article, and you can quote away.
While I'm looking it up, let me have you talk about this, and that is creating the next generation of leaders, because that is an important factor.
I go to some of the student organization meetings. I go to SAMRC, which is the students for student advocates for medical and recreational marijuana. They got a petition on the ballot here in Mount Pleasant. It passed with 63% to decriminalize marijuana in Mount Pleasant. And the change is, yeah, clap away, it didn't do anything. You still get arrested. It has nothing, because they say it's still under.
It will in November.
Hopefully, God, I'm hoping on that one. But there's no guarantee. If you're on campus, you're really doomed, because there is no, this is state property, and they don't handle pot like they do outside. You go to the student, student code enforcement? Student conduct. You can't bring a lawyer. You can bring a lawyer where you want, but they got to shut up. They can't say anything. The rules of evidence are completely against you. So there's those kind of things. But some of these things work, but you can go.
I have to share this because Matt made a point to find this. He was very excited when he gave it to me, because here is some advice that he says, it came from a letter to the editor. This was from 2015. And the idea is that how slow a process making change can be, this is what they're talking about, and that the students either need, quote, sustained support that we talked about, spanning many years, or to take direct action in order to see change on campus. And the speaker said the only recent example of successful student change was back when CMU students did not get classes off for Martin Luther King Jr. Day until they occupied a building and their demands were met. The speaker, according to this letter to the editor, was CMU President George Ross.
So, don't listen to me. Listen to an expert. If you want to get change, take over something. That's what the president suggests that you do. You know?
And may I clarify that the views expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of WCMU Public Media.
There are lots of issues, and there are things that you people should be, the students here should be interested in. We have some really great things around. There are people at the reservation here who went to Dakota, and they have very interesting stories. As far as I know, none of them have ever spoke at CMU. Nobody's talked. I don't care if you're against it or for it. You can be completely against it, but it's an historical event. It should be interviewed. The marijuana policy in Michigan changed things around, that a lot of dispensaries in this state were closed. And it was because of a legal action in Mount Pleasant. The prosecutor is Larry Burdick. He's still here. The person who was the one who he charged is Brandon McQueen, who is still here, and by the way, on the school board. Yay. And they should be, bring them back, bring them into debate. And if you don't like, if you want somebody who can talk legalese with Burdick, you could bring in Matt Abel. Matt Abel has two qualifications. He is the president of Normal in Michigan, and he is the son of Harold Abel, the president of CMU.
Okay.
So
Let me ask you, Matt, getting back briefly to this issue of continuity. As we were talking before, you said when it comes to campus protests, and particularly with students in for a semester, going back home for the summer, one of the greatest threats is simply delay.
yeah, all you have to do is, all you need to do, you come up with some action. You're not going to, in September, you got to get things together. You couple months, you're working on it. You hit Thanksgiving break, you're doomed. You're no longer going to do anything the rest of that semester because nobody comes back from Thanksgiving break except studies for finals. Now you got Christmas break. Got to come back in January. Probably takes you a little while until February to get into action again. Hits February. All you got to do is delay it until spring break. Once spring break happens, nothing's going to happen over that, and as soon as you're in summer, you have to reinvent the wheel in the fall. And there's a lot, there are a lot of things that people could do here that, and I'm going to do this real quick. Sexual assaults on campus. According to the federal government, the percentage, the ratio for women who are sexually assaulted on campus is 1 in 4, 1 in 5. That works out to about 650 people a semester, a school year. According to SAPA, the group that helps with women that's on campus, usually that's not very, usually they don't tell you the numbers. One year they said 300. That same year, 650, now it's only 300. According to the university, there were 4. So what happened to all the others? Quickly, the university, just last week, they had to get, the university was told about a sexual assault. The university did not share their information with the local prosecutors. The local law enforcement had to subpoena the university to get them to tell what had happened. So who was the university interested in protecting? The person who was attacked or the sexual predator?
Well, this could be another discussion into itself. Yeah, and it is hard to know the motivations because of the laws involved and everything, but we're not going to go in that direction right now.
You should have another panel sometime for the history of feminism through the ages. I think there are some, you have qualified people here, you have people who started the Take Back the Night, you have rape counseling.
And as we're talking about feminists, we have one right next to you who has tremendous experience, and that's Janice Fialka. Yeah, and known because, as I hear, the personal is also political, and you depict that so very well. Give us a little background first. What was your involvement when you were at CMU?
Yeah, well, I definitely was involved. I wasn't in the building. I was outside the building, was involved in a lot of the marches, both here as well as in Washington, D.C. Eventually then, after even I left campus, I got involved in the Seneca Falls Peace Camp movement. There were women's peace camps that were around the world that were really protesting the deployment of the cruise missiles. Actually went to Greenham Common out in England, and we circled the base with thousands and thousands of women. So my commitment to peace definitely began here. My eyes were opened and continued. I think what I want to just share for the few minutes I have up here is the power of the women's movement here at Central. And through Kathy Courtney and many other people, they opened our eyes and began to help us know that we had lived a very limited life in many ways. In the first panel, you asked people what were your favorite songs. Yes. I'm going to read a part of one of my favorite poems, because one of the things that I did get involved here was learning a lot about poetry. And some of you may remember Marge Piercy, who grew up in Detroit. She's a poet, a feminist, and she spoke at CMU in the 1970s, part of that cultural thing that you talked about, Denny. And she wrote a poem using the bonsai tree as a metaphor. And I won't read the whole poem, but I want to read a little bit of it and bring her in and her image. And as you know, the bonsai tree is the Japanese art that really prunes back the trees, and that can be a very stunning work of art, but it's also a metaphor for oppression. So, the bonsai tree in the attractive pot could have grown 80 feet tall on the side of a mountain till split by lightning. But a gardener carefully pruned it. It is 9 inches high. And I think that many of us came to Central, especially the women, 9 inches high, if you will. I mean, I had a good life, but there was this incredible oppression that we really weren't totally aware of. It was sort of like this rumbling. that we experienced. And so we were catapulted into a different way, a new way of being as women. And one of the ways that I think really transformed us, and all of us, men and women, is consciousness raising groups. So this opportunity to bring women together in church basements, in hallways and dorms, all different places, and we began to tell our stories. Reluctantly at first, carefully, shyly, but our boldness, came through as we began to hear that what we were experiencing wasn't just personal, but it came out of an oppression. It came out of norms that really limited women. And that was a powerful moment for us. And I think that everyone here, especially women in this audience, can relate to what it was like for us then, because we have a resurgence of that with the Me Too movement, where women in particular, are being able to share, this is what I have gone through and I will take it no more. And so the lesson for us, and you can hear it in all of our stories, is that we're beginning to break the silence. And that's when Kathy was talking about, how do we do this? We do it by breaking the silence. We do it by telling our stories. We do it by listening to other stories as well. So I think that was a major part of what transformed me and continued to. And I would just share that one of my favorite quotes, because I end up being a storyteller, is words are how we think, stories are how we link, how we create community. And that's a lot of what, you can hear it in all of the stories that we've shared tonight. We've created a community. And I'll leap forward. I know we're sort of limited in time, but about 33 years ago, I gave birth to a son, my son Micah, who has an intellectual disability, what we used to call mental retardation. So initially, when I was still active around peace movements, but I saw what he was experiencing as sort of a special education issue. And then it hit me that this was a social justice issue. He belonged in this world as much as his peers who didn't have a disability. And I began to look back at what I learned in the women's movement, to break the silence, to know we belong, to not expect that the institutions were going to change because it was a good idea, but because we were going to seize it and make it happen. And so there's a book out there that describes his whole life, but what I want you to know is that he was fully included throughout his whole life. And really the roots of that happened for me here at Central, because we told stories, because we supported each other, because we took to the streets, because we started a women's center. There's that link that goes there as well. And I want to tell a very quick story. Our son Micah was part of the new wave of students with intellectual disabilities who went to college. Kids with mental retardation years ago didn't go to college. They went to community-based programs. But we created a fully inclusive program for Micah. He grew up with a sense of disability pride, very similar to the women's movement, that sense of ownership. And he decided that he wanted to move into the dorm. But kids like Micah didn't live in the dorm, but he was attending the university through a special program. And he decided that the university refused to let him live in the dorm. And he protested that, ended up suing the university. The story I want to tell comes out of the fact that he was in a deposition where he was grilled for 5 hours to find out why he was doing this. And about a week later, then we were deposed. And so the lawyers were asking me questions about Micah, and at some point, both lawyers went out of the room. And the court stenographer looked up at me and she said, I know I'm not supposed to talk to you, but I just have to tell you that I was in the room when your son Micah was in the room, and you must be so proud of him. And I thanked her for that. And then she said, I realized when I listened to Micah, your son, that my son has a disability and I need to begin to be an advocate for him. Yeah. Read more about him. It's quite an amazing story. But that advocacy, that's the story, that our story moves people. Just like we're all 8 of us here are so eager to hear what you all want to say and share with us, because your story matters to us. There's that interplay between that, so ask me a question. I could go on and on, but yeah.
Well, I'm going to leave it so that the audience here in the auditorium can ask you some questions, because there's so much that I know each of you can share.
Can I mention just real quickly?
Yes.
I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a couple people. Lou Oates, who has since passed, a brilliant African-American who was here on campus when we were here. John Fraker, who started the tenants union and used to drive down to Lansing to pick up the New York Times and bring it up here because we couldn't get it. And Paul Puma, who was very active in the peace movement and would be here today, except he's undergoing medical treatment in Houston.
Okay, very good, thank you.
I'd like to add 3 slogans, quick ones to encapsulate the whole thing that we've been talking about. Question authority, speak truth to power, and persistence prevails when all else fails.
Amen.
John, Denny, Matt, Janice, thank you for being on this panel this evening. Thank you for joining us as we talked about student activism then and now, and may we all follow our beliefs with passion and energy like the people we've heard from tonight. Thanks for joining us for this event, produced by WCMU Public Media. Good night.